It's November 22nd, 2025. Picture this. You're inside the cool, pressurized air of the G20 summit in Johannesburg.
Right.
And you'd normally expect the standard diplomatic choreography, stiff handshakes, rehearsed unity.
The big family photo of all the world leaders.
Exactly. But behind the closed doors in the European delegation rooms, the mood it wasn't just tense. It was practically vibrating with disbelief.
Because a document had just started circulating.
A leaked document, a draft of a 28-point American peace plan for Ukraine. And as the details went around the table, the reaction, it wasn't debate.
No.
It was just a cold, stunned silence. 1 minute, everyone thinks the West is holding the line together. The next, European officials are reading clauses that just seem to dismantle their entire security architecture.
Things like capping Ukraine's military at 600,000 personnel.
Freezing front lines into permanent borders. And a hard, codified no to NATO membership.
And the most jarring part, I think, wasn't even the concessions themselves. It was the sheer suddenness of it.
It was the realization, right there in that room, that their closest ally, the United States, appeared to be redrawing the map of Europe without actually asking the Europeans to hold the pen.
The text didn't read like a joint strategy.
Not at all. To the people in that room, it read like a unilateral exit ticket. And in that quiet moment, looking at those 28 points, the Atlantic Alliance didn't just show a crack. It looked like it was about to split wide open.
And that profound moment of geopolitical shock, that's precisely what we are diving into today. Our mission is pretty clear. We are analyzing this growing transatlantic rift, which is all centered on the best strategy for a durable peace in Ukraine.
And this goes so far beyond just a policy disagreement.
Oh, it's a collision of long-term security interests and, frankly, geopolitical priorities that have been brewing for years.
That's exactly right. And for you, listening, this deep dive is essential because it fundamentally dissects these two competing visions for the future of European security. At the heart of it all is this profound tension.
On one side, you have the U.S. desire for a rapid geopolitical exit.
And on the other, the European necessity to uphold that foundational post-World War II principle, that borders cannot be changed by force.
And if we let that U.S. draft stand as is, the implications, they just ripple out everywhere. They reach into international law, the principle of sovereign integrity, and the very future of the security architecture built since 1945.
The Europeans saw this U.S. proposal not as some careful diplomatic opening.
Not at all. They saw it as a unilateral exit ticket for the U.S., leaving Europe exposed, and all those principles just abandoned. So we have to understand exactly what is in this plan, why the Americans pushed it, and why the Europeans reacted with such overwhelming resistance.
Okay, so let's unpack the origins of this shockwave. The minute this 28-point document leaked, the first question wasn't even about the content, was it? It was about who exactly wrote it.
Yes, and the confusion around its parentage is a central part of this whole crisis.
What's so fascinating about that initial period is just how quickly the narrative shifted.
It's dizzying. Initially, the U.S. administration confirmed the document was authentic, but then the pushback, especially from congressional Republicans who felt the concessions were just too great, it forced an immediate strategic retreat.
So they walked it back almost instantly. How did they even try to spin the authorship then?
The official line immediately began to blur. We saw reports that Secretary of State Rubio, in calls with key senators, was suggesting the plan had actually originated with Moscow.
With Moscow.
Yes, describing it very tellingly as a Russian wish list.
Wow.
And this maneuver was, designed to distance the White House from the most egregious concessions, but it immediately complicated the diplomatic picture.
Of course, because if the U.S. is circulating a Russian wish list as its own peace plan, that suggests either incompetence or
an alarming level of compliance with Kremlin demands. Either way, it's not a good look.
And then came the public softening, trying to reframe the whole diplomatic disaster.
Exactly. The official statements were quickly adjusted. They started insisting the document was merely a starting point, or a living, breathing document designed to facilitate dialogue, not a final offer.
But that damage control only confirmed the systemic failure that happened before the leak, right?
Yeah, it really did. It exposed how poorly coordinated and vetted the plan was. It suggested the administration was just not prepared to defend the actual content they had circulated.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, I think, for anyone following how foreign policy is actually made. The consensus among critics is that this plan was developed entirely outside of official U.S. foreign policy institutions. Can you get into that process failure?
This is the core structural defect. We are talking about policy development that completely, and I mean completely, bypassed the interagency process, the State Department, the National Security Council, the NSC, the Pentagon, the intelligence community.
All the bodies that are supposed to vet policy for legal viability, strategic implications, coordinating with allies.
All of them. They were essentially sidelined. This is not normal policymaking. It suggests a small, closed group of informal advisors and politically motivated intermediaries were operating way outside the established chains of command.
And we have some idea who these figures were, don't we? The suspicion points pretty strongly toward Kremlin-linked envoys having some input.
The sources point specifically to key external advisors and figures like Kirill Dmitriev, who's been reported as a major link in previous unofficial peace talks, having significant influence on the draft's language.
And the content itself.
The content, yes. It's been noted that some sections of the plan read like they were mechanically translated from Russian policy documents. It even includes highly specific language that echoes Russian ultimatums issued since 2022.
So by bypassing the institutional experts.
They ended up just recycling talking points that every single professional diplomat would have flagged as, well, strategically catastrophic.
And the internal fallout from this just confirmed how deep the division ran.
Absolutely. The immediate consequence was the resignation of Keith Kellogg,
the president's special representative for Russia and Ukraine.
Exactly. And his resignation signaled deep internal disagreement. It confirmed that this informal policy track, led by the president's representative in the negotiations, Stephen Witkoff, had completely circumvented the official channels.
And that led to a diplomatic panic.
It did. It forced an emergency meeting in Geneva involving U.S., Ukrainian, and European representatives. The U.S. administration was essentially forced to sit down and deal with the very allies they had just humiliated and ignored.
That humiliation brings us right back to the G20 and that profound European reaction. I mean, they were marginalized, blindsided, and betrayed. Their reaction wasn't just diplomatic disagreement. It was an existential shock.
That phrase you used earlier, cold, stunned silence, it just captures the mood perfectly. The Europeans were confronting a document that not only ceded European territory, but also redefined their own security parameters, and they learned about it through a leak.
So their collective initial statement that the plan required additional work.
That was the most polite diplomatic signal for this is completely and utterly unacceptable.
And what was the core of that critique? Why was this seen as such an act of marginalization?
The critique is that Europe is being written out of its own future. That's the phrase you hear. They're being treated as a secondary player in its own security architecture, which is just a harsh indictment of the whole alliance structure.
So European leaders felt they were paying the price for past complacency.
Yes, for having outsourced strategic defense and high-level geopolitical decision-making to Washington for decades. And now, in the most critical security crisis since the Cold War, Washington was unilaterally deciding the terms of peace.
The anecdote about the German Chancellery aide, Thomas, it really crystallizes this feeling of exclusion. It highlights the profound irony of a veteran European strategist having to rely on a leak to understand the future of his own continent.
That image is so potent. Thomas, representing one of the largest EU nations, having to download a crucial U.S. proposal from an open leak site because the official secure channels hadn't been used. It's a perfect symbol of disrespect.
He reportedly whispered something like, "We are just the landscape, not the architects."
And that deep sense of exclusion of watching decisions about Europe being made over Europe's head, that is the driving force behind Europe's urgent demand for strategic autonomy, which we'll get into. They realize if they don't hold the pen, someone else will redraw their borders.
Okay, so now we have to transition from the shock of the leak to the actual substance of the plan. Yeah. Because the details, once everyone reviewed them, confirmed all the worst fears. Critiques universally label the plan as fundamentally pro-Russian.
Strategically catastrophic.
And designed to reward aggression.
The language and structure of the 28 points are what gave so much credence to those claims that this was a Russian wish list. Analysts very quickly noted that the plan adopted Moscow's framing of the war. It didn't just meet Russian demands, it often echoed Russian ultimatums issued since 2022.
Portraying Ukraine as the difficult one.
Exactly, as the intransigent party, and Russia as a nation merely seeking to protect its security concerns.
I mean, if you compare this draft to previous Russian non-papers, the duplication of demands it's alarmingly consistent. The territorial concessions, neutralization, sanctions relief.
And it serves multiple purposes for Moscow. It functions as a propaganda instrument. For one, forcing the U.S. to present Russian demands to Ukraine, and strategically it achieves major war aims without Russia having to fire another shot.
Just by leveraging America's desire for a quick exit.
Exactly.
Let's start with the absolute core issue then, territorial integrity. Provision 21 is where the plan demands the formalization of territorial amputations. We need to detail this.
Provision 21 is the most politically and legally fraught section of the entire plan. It outlines a sweeping set of concessions that would overturn decades of international precedent. First, it requires the United States to recognize Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk as de facto Russian territory.
Which is a monumental shift. The U.S. has steadfastly refused to recognize these annexations since 2014.
A complete reversal, and it doesn't stop with the territories Russia already fully controls.
Right. For the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia, the plan mandates that the front lines be frozen along the current line of contact.
Which effectively amounts to de facto recognition of Russian control over whatever portion of those regions they currently hold. But the requirement goes even further into territory that Ukraine currently controls.
Yes, this is the part. The demand that Ukraine must withdraw from territory it still holds in Donetsk Oblast.
This is the real concession that outraged Kyiv and Europe. Provision 21 requires Ukrainian forces to withdraw from the remaining, approximately 25% of the Donetsk Oblast that they currently control.
And that chunk of land, thousands of square miles,
would then be established as a neutral, demilitarized buffer zone. And crucially, the plan specifies that this buffer zone belongs to the Russian Federation, even though Russian forces would not immediately enter it.
So Russia achieves its war aim of controlling the entire administrative region of Donetsk without having to fight for the last quarter. And they gain a substantial net amount of territory overall.
Precisely. It legitimizes conquest. And the legal headache this creates for Ukraine is immediate and paralyzing. We have to remember Article 73 of the Ukrainian Constitution,
Which states
that any attempt to alter the territory of Ukraine requires an all-Ukrainian referendum. The president can't just unilaterally sign away territory. The Ukrainian parliament can't approve it without a constitutional amendment.
So if President Zelensky or any future leader were to agree to Provision 21 as written, they would immediately face a political collapse.
Mass protests, likely legal challenges. It would effectively end U.S.-Ukrainian cooperation regardless of the ceasefire. The plan is politically impossible for Kyiv.
It creates an impossible choice.
It does. It asks Ukraine to choose between continuing the war and committing political suicide by violating its own constitution and founding principles.
And this is where we have to connect that diplomatic jargon back to the individuals affected. The Olena anecdote, the story about the history teacher in Zaporizhia, is so vital here.
It is. It illustrates the human consequence of freezing an arbitrary line.
Tell us that story.
Well, the story of Elena, who teaches history and understands the deep symbolic weight of land, it just brings the conflict home. If the front line in Zaporizhia is frozen along the current line of contact, her ancestral family cemetery, where her husband and her parents are buried, would fall under Russian occupation.
So it becomes legally defined as foreign soil.
Foreign soil. Imagine the personal tragedy of having your family history suddenly categorized as inaccessible, or only accessible through enemy visas. It highlights the brutal reality. Diplomats draw lines on maps, but those lines cut right through lives, memories, and personal sovereignty.
And if we compare this to the 2022 Istanbul Communique, which was the last serious attempt at a comprehensive deal, we can see how dramatically this U.S. proposal shifts the goalposts in Russia's favor.
The Istanbul draft, while it required concessions, was strategically very different. It largely excluded territorial issues from the security guarantees. It essentially postponed the difficult questions of Crimea and Donbass until a later date.
Kicking the can down the road.
For years, likely. But the new U.S. plan demands explicit, immediate recognition of Russian control over Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. It institutionalizes Russian gains. It shifts the whole dynamic from conflict postponement to legalized surrender of territory.
Okay, let's move to the military side. This is crucial for long-term European stability. Provisions 6, 7, and 8 deal with constraints on Ukraine's capacity and the NATO barrier.
Right. Provision 6 directly addresses military capacity. It caps Ukraine's armed forces at 600,000 personnel.
Now, 600,000 is still a massive standing army.
It is, but it's a significant cut from Ukraine's wartime peak of around 880,000. And crucially, this provision fulfills a long-standing Russian demand for demilitarization, even if the number is higher than the minimal figure of 85,000 that Russia proposed back in the 2022 negotiations.
The strategic concern here isn't just the number, though. It's the context. Does this cap prevent Ukraine from establishing effective long-term deterrence?
That's the key question. Ukraine needs to maintain a credible deterrent force against a much larger, albeit bruised, Russian military. By forcing a specific cap, the U.S. plan weakens Ukraine's ability to rebuild its capacity and potentially leaves it exposed if Russia simply uses the ceasefire as an operational pause.
Which feeds directly into the fears of Eastern European states.
Directly. And those fears are compounded by the codified NATO barrier. Provision 7 demands Ukraine enshrine non-NATO membership in its constitution, while Provision 8 states that NATO must agree not to station troops in Ukraine.
So these two provisions together deliver Russia one of its core pre-war objectives.
The absolute neutralization of Ukraine. The constitutional requirement is a permanent roadblock, and the NATO commitment not to station troops removes any residual deterrent effect from the alliance's eastern flank. The message to Eastern Europe is crystal clear. The West is willing to sacrifice NATO's open-door policy for short-term expediency.
Which brings us back to that Eastern European perspective, particularly the Rizzo dinner anecdote. Their history dictates a very specific understanding of a frozen conflict.
The Polish official, Marek, captured the regional sentiment perfectly. He asked the U.S. envoy, "Do you know what we call a frozen line in this part of the world? We call it a pause for reloading."
And that isn't just abstract fear.
Not at all. It's rooted in historical precedent. Look at Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. These frozen conflicts were merely pauses that allowed Russia to consolidate control, destabilize neighboring states, and dictate the future terms of engagement.
So by forcing Ukraine to structurally weaken itself with Provision 6
and eliminate the NATO deterrent with Provision 7.
The U.S. plan creates the optimal conditions for Russia to execute a reloading pause and resume the conflict at a time of its choosing.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pivot now to the incredibly controversial economic elements. Provisions 13 and 14, dealing with sanctions and frozen assets. Provision 13 seems to hand Russia a major geopolitical victory.
It does. Provision 13 guarantees Russia's staged reintegration into the global economy, including sanctions relief, contingent on progress in the peace process. But it also suggests an invitation for Russia to rejoin the G8.
A symbolic and political validation that Putin has wanted for years.
And it decouples sanctions relief from full withdrawal or payment of reparations, which Europe views as morally and strategically unacceptable. Russia gets political validation simply for entering talks.
But Provision 14, on the frozen funds. In my view, this is the most jaw-dropping element of the entire plan, because it puts the U.S. in a position to profit massively.
Provision 14 is extraordinary. It caused immediate alarm across the Atlantic. It proposes that the U.S. would seize control of $100 billion of frozen Russian assets, the majority of which are held in European institutions, not U.S. ones.
And these funds will be invested in U.S.-led reconstruction efforts in Ukraine.
But here's the highly problematic kicker. The U.S. would receive 50% of the profits generated from these investments.
Wait, hold on. So the U.S. is taking European-held Russian assets, managing them through a U.S.-led fund, dictating how they're spent, and then claiming half the profits. That sounds like a unilateral financial power grab.
That is precisely the European interpretation. It positions the U.S. not just as an ally, but as the primary financier, regulator, and profit center of the post-war reconstruction order.
And it gets worse.
It does. The plan further compels Europe to match this sum, forcing them to contribute another $100 billion to the reconstruction fund. And finally, the remaining frozen Russian funds would go into a joint U.S.-Russian investment vehicle.
Why would the U.S. propose such a contentious profit-sharing scheme? Is this just about securing funding, or is there a deeper geopolitical motivation?
There are a couple of motivations which the Europeans immediately resisted. First, it establishes legal and administrative control over a massive pool of assets. That allows the U.S. to set the standard for asset seizure and allocation, a potent financial tool for future conflicts.
And second,
by compelling Europe to match the U.S. contribution, it forces European financial institutions to shoulder a heavy burden, and it subordinates the European role in reconstruction to U.S. oversight. This proposal is viewed in Paris and Berlin not as a strategy for peace, but as a mechanism for establishing U.S. financial hegemony in the post-conflict landscape.
It's just unacceptable to the Europeans.
And deeply insulting to Russia, who demands the full return of those assets. It's a non-starter for everyone but the U.S.
Okay, let's touch on Provision 26, the accountability gap. This proposal for a blanket amnesty seems designed solely to allow Russia to escape any legal consequences for its actions.
Provision 26 mandates full amnesty for all parties involved in the conflict. It means agreeing not to pursue any claims for past actions, reparations, or liability for destruction. For Russia, this is a non-negotiable core demand, escaping legal liability for war crimes and the vast physical destruction wrought in Ukraine.
But to achieve full amnesty, wouldn't that require some extraordinary legal gymnastics? You'd have to effectively hamstring global bodies like the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
Absolutely. The amnesty would need to apply not just domestically within Ukraine and Russia, but it would have to find a way to shield individuals from international prosecution. This is morally and legally uncomfortable for Western allies who've spent years documenting war crimes. Critics see this as aligning entirely with the Kremlin's core objective, securing Russia's interests at the expense of justice and placing the responsibility for compromise solely on the West.
It forces the West to endorse impunity.
It does.
So the original U.S. plan was clearly dead on arrival for the Europeans, which forced them to act decisively. This leads to the rapid drafting of the European 28-point counterproposal driven by the E3 France, Germany, and the U.K.
This was Europe grabbing the pen back.
It had to be.
This was the moment Europe transitioned from shocked observers to active architects of their own future. The E3 counterproposal wasn't a minor edit. It was a fundamental strategic correction designed to be less pro-Russian, upholding key international principles that the U.S. plan had just abandoned. It was a clear assertion. Europe refuses to be merely the landscape.
Let's go through the key modifications, starting again with the most contentious element, Provision 21, territory. How did the E3 adjust this while still trying to find a path to stopping the fighting?
The E3 counterproposal used a really crucial distinction regarding territorial concession. It mandated that Ukraine would commit not to recover occupied sovereign territory through military means, which is a pragmatic concession, acknowledging the difficulty of reversing current realities. But critically, any subsequent negotiations on territorial swaps must start from the line of contact.
So no giving away the remaining 25% of Donetsk.
Precisely. Unlike the U.S. plan, the European version explicitly prevented Russia from seizing that additional 25% of Donetsk and establishing the demilitarized zone the U.S. plan granted. The European framing ensures that if the conflict is frozen, the frozen line itself is the limit of Russian de facto gain.
It moves the proposal back toward the logic of the 2022 Istanbul Communiqué.
Right, prioritizing conflict management over institutionalized conquest.
But here's the challenge, and this is what many in Eastern Europe worry about. Doesn't even the European compromise risk codifying some level of Russian gain? Doesn't it still set a precedent, even if it prevents the seizure of extra territory?
That is a legitimate strategic risk, and it highlights the painful trade-off required for any ceasefire. The European approach tries to find a pragmatic line, accepting the current reality of the front line to stop the killing, but refusing to grant legal sovereignty or additional territory beyond what Russia currently holds. It's an attempt to minimize the precedent setting while maximizing the chance of immediate de-escalation.
But that inherent moral hazard of rewarding any aggression remains the central tension.
It absolutely does.
How did the Europeans handle the military limitations, specifically the cap on Ukraine's armed forces in Provision 6?
The E3 significantly increased the cap, raising it from 600,000 to 800,000 personnel. And crucially, they added context. They clarified that this cap applies only in peacetime.
That's a key distinction.
It is. The ambiguity of the U.S. proposal was the 600,000, the required strength during the ceasefire or forever, was removed. The higher cap, along with the peacetime context, was vital for Eastern European states who feared the U.S. plan was deliberately, structurally weakening Ukraine to the point of inviting the next conflict.
And what about the existential threat to NATO's open door policy, Provision 7, demanding a constitutional ban on Ukrainian membership?
The E3 completely sidestepped the constitutional ban. They replaced it with a statement that just acknowledged the existing diplomatic reality. It said, Ukraine joining NATO depends on consensus of NATO members, which does not exist.
Which is accurate, but it's not a permanent ban.
Exactly. Unlike the U.S. proposal, it leaves the door open for future membership if the geopolitical climate shifts and consensus is ever reached. It denies Russia the permanent, codified neutralization of Ukraine it demands, and it preserves a fundamental tenet of NATO policy.
Okay, let's talk about the money again, Provision 14. The European response to the U.S. proposal for profit sharing and financial control was probably their most uncompromising stance.
The E3 response was unequivocal. They dismantled the entire U.S. profit sharing scheme. The European counterproposal mandated that Russian sovereign assets would remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine.
That fundamentally shifts the purpose of the funds.
Completely. They are no longer a vehicle for U.S. profit or some U.S.-Russian joint investment. They become a mechanism for compensation and accountability. It aligns far better with international principles of state responsibility and reinforces the idea that Russia must pay for the destruction it caused.
It rejected the notion that the U.S. could unilaterally dictate the use of European-held funds.
Flat out rejected it.
And the amnesty clause, provision 26. How do they navigate that moral dilemma of justice versus expediency?
The Europeans chose to preserve the possibility of justice. They avoided the blanket legal shielding of the U.S.-Russian demand. Instead of full amnesty, they substituted a more general statement.
Which
provision will be made to address the suffering of victims of the conflict. This sidestepped the need to guarantee impunity while acknowledging the political requirement for some kind of reconciliation process. It's a diplomatic tightrope walk designed to maintain pressure for eventual accountability.
This strategic counterstrike is fascinating because it fundamentally reveals Europe's new position on strategic autonomy. What does this resistance tell us about the future of European defense and foreign policy?
This resistance is the proof point that strategic autonomy is no longer just some philosophical, academic ambition. It's a desperate geopolitical necessity. Europe saw the U.S. plan as prioritizing American expediency, a fast exit to focus on other global priorities over the long-term durable stability of the continent.
But what does strategic autonomy actually mean in tangible terms post-G20?
It translates into several concrete needs. First, independent defense procurement and capability. Europe realized they cannot rely solely on U.S. military hardware or logistical support. Second, independent command structures, moving away from systems that always default to U.S. leadership.
And third, and most relevant here,
independent diplomatic action. Strategic autonomy means having the capacity and the willingness to draft and enforce a security plan that is distinct from Washington's preferences. The E3 counterproposal is the first major example of Europe collectively holding the pen on continental security and saying, we have our own red lines and they are different from yours.
They're saying they will no longer tolerate being the landscape.
Exactly.
This whole conversation about territorial concession, though, whether it's under the U.S. plan or the European plan, it forces us to address the fundamental legal impossibility of this proposal. Can this 28-point plan or any document that legitimizes the results of aggression actually be a legally binding treaty under international law?
The answer, from a strictly legal standpoint, is almost certainly no, at least not concerning the transfer of territory. And this brings us to the hard line of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, or VCLT, specifically Article 52.
Okay, let's slow down and define VCLT Article 52 for everyone listening. What's the historical context that gave rise to this specific rule, and what does it state about treaties concluded after the use of force?
So Article 52 is one of the most critical legal pillars established in the post-WWII era, though its roots go back further to principles like the Stimson Doctrine in the 1930s. Essentially, the international community realized that if conquest is successful, there has to be a mechanism to prevent that success from gaining legal recognition.
Okay.
So Article 52 states that a treaty is void ab initio void from the start, as if it never existed, if its conclusion was procured by the threat or use of force in violation of the UN Charter.
So if Russia invaded Ukraine and then forced Ukraine to sign a treaty ceding territory, that treaty is legally worthless.
Precisely. And the application here is undeniable. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly denounced Russia's invasion as an act of aggression contrary to the UN Charter. Since Ukraine, as a sovereign state, would never voluntarily agree to cede its territory or permanently renounce NATO aspirations, any agreement forcing these concessions falls directly under the VCLT Article 52 prohibition.
So the legal status remains unaffected by political arguments that this is the necessary lesser evil to stop the fighting.
The result is still the product of a legal force. The law doesn't bend on that.
This means if Ukraine's president, even with parliamentary approval, were to formally transfer sovereignty over Crimea, Luhansk, or Donetsk under this plan, that transfer would be legally invalid in the eyes of the international legal framework.
That's the consensus among legal experts. The treaty would be void. And this ties into a crucial related principle, the customary international law principle known as the Stimson Doctrine, which is now codified in Article 412 of the Articles on State Responsibility.
Let's elaborate on the Stimson Doctrine. If the treaty is void, what duty does that place on the rest of the world on third states?
The Stimson Doctrine establishes a customary duty of non-recognition. It means that third states, France, Germany, the US, Canada, everyone have a legal obligation not to recognize the effects of an annexation achieved through force. They must treat the occupied territory as if sovereignty still belongs to the victim state, Ukraine.
How is that non-recognition enforced practically? It can't just be a diplomatic statement, can it?
No, it requires action. Non-recognition mandates that third states must prevent trade and investment that assists Russia in maintaining control over those territories. This translates into concrete policy. Refusing to issue visas to citizens listing their place of birth as Russian Crimea, banning corporate investment in occupied regions, ensuring financial institutions do not facilitate transactions originating from those territories under Russian jurisdiction.
So this customary duty acts as a critical safeguard.
It does. Even if a peace agreement attempts to heal the annexations politically, the legal obligations of the rest of the world remain unchanged.
So legally, this U.S. plan, aiming for a binding treaty that transfers sovereignty, is dead on arrival because the law withholds its blessing.
That is the essential conclusion. Because international law will not sanction a victorious peace dictated by force, the 28-point plan cannot take the form of a legally binding treaty transferring sovereignty. The only viable form for agreement that involves these concessions, however distasteful, is a non-binding political agreement, perhaps something similar to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
And in that non-binding scenario, the de jure situation remains clean. Ukraine's sovereignty over the occupied territories formally remains intact,
Which allows for the possibility of their eventual return, even if the de facto situation is frozen for years or even decades. That's the crucial difference. A non-binding political agreement preserves the principle of sovereignty and keeps the legal door open for future resolutions. The moment you attempt to make it a binding treaty that forces territorial transfer, you violate Article 52, and the treaty becomes legally null.
The drafters of the U.S. plan seem to have just ignored this fundamental legal reality.
Or didn't care. Which leads us to the systemic defects of the plan. The legal problems are compounded by the political and structural defects, which critics have called amateurish and diplomatically illiterate.
The structural defects reveal that whole flawed process of the plan's creation outside official channels.
Right. First, there's the intellectual laziness. The plan was essentially a cut and paste of previous Kremlin ultimatums from 2022 to 2025. There was no innovation, no strategic creativity designed to meet both sides halfway. It just recycled Russian demands.
Second, the lack of professional diplomatic review meant the plan was operating under fantasies, completely divorced from political reality.
Absolutely. The informal advisors operated under the fantasy that Ukraine could legally cede territory, despite its constitution. They fantasized that Europe would quietly accept massive sanctions relief and a loss of control over frozen assets. They fantasized that Russia, based on its history, would honor promises under a non-binding deal. These were strategically impossible assumptions that any experienced diplomat would have immediately rejected.
And third, the exclusion of key stakeholders. Europe, Ukraine, NATO, and even U.S. institutions themselves ensured that the plan was politically dead on arrival.
A conflict taking place on Ukrainian soil affecting European security requires the participation of Europe and Ukraine. Violating that first principle of diplomacy, nothing is decided about others without their participation, guaranteed that Europe would mount a fierce immediate counterstrike. The U.S. plan was drafted in isolation, making it politically, legally, and strategically impossible to implement as written.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize the contents of the 28 points, the legal constraints, and the fierce transatlantic backlash? The current draft U.S. peace plan, it isn't a solution to the war. It's a profound flashpoint that has fundamentally shaken the Western alliance.
That's the core takeaway. The plan has driven a profound wedge between Washington and its European allies over the very definition of durable peace. For the U.S., durability in this context has been framed by expediency and managing its immediate geopolitical risk, pivoting away from Europe. For Europe, durability requires unwavering adherence to principle, sovereignty, and robust deterrence.
The state of play now is extremely complex. We know that negotiations continue, with the European counterproposal pushing a far more principled line. But the gap remains enormous.
Russia still wants capitulation, and Europe and Ukraine demand principle, participation, and accountability.
The essential truth is that the immediate peace process right now is not solely between Russia and Ukraine. It is fundamentally an internal transatlantic conflict, a geopolitical reckoning between the United States and its European allies over how to end a war that is reshaping the continent.
The quest for expediency, detached from European concerns and fundamental legal principles, is the driving force behind the current instability.
The ultimate geopolitical reality is this. Peace must be achieved, but international law dictates the terms under which that peace can be recognized. While pragmatic, dirty deals can certainly be made through non-binding political agreements, freezing front lines and halting the killing, the law categorically withholds its blessings and especially legal force from any agreement that seeks to formally transfer territory obtained by aggression. The ongoing internal struggle is whether the Atlantic Alliance can find a path that is both pragmatic enough to stop the conflict and principled enough to hold the Western security architecture together. That internal conflict is now the prevailing geopolitical reality.